Chapter 9: Campaigns and Voting Behavior. In this chapter, we will take a close look at our electoral system. We'll start by evaluating the current nominating process for presidential candidates and then explore the key objectives of presidential campaigns. Next, we'll look at the role of money in campaigns and determine why campaigns have a limited impact on election outcomes. We'll then consider the voters and look at why people vote or don't vote and the factors that influence their voting behavior. Finally, we'll evaluate the fairness of the Electoral College, which has come under a lot of criticism since the 2000 election, along with several advantages and disadvantages of our electoral system. The nomination game. So, earning a party's nomination for office requires money, media attention, and momentum. Candidates must develop a smart campaign strategy to have a hope of winning their party's nomination. A campaign is really a test of endurance and energy. You live with sleep deprivation, as we saw in the Journeys with George video. They eat junk food, they don't get exercise, they don't really have life outside the campaign for year after year. However, in other nations, other wealthy democracies, campaigns usually last no more than 2 months. So this is really different than other countries like, say, the UK. They campaign hard for about 2 months and then they get back to work. Before candidates for each party can campaign against each other in a general election, they have to compete against other potential nominees within their own party's primary elections. And these elections are held to determine the delegates for each candidate. The delegates assemble at the National Party Convention, and the winner is known often before they arrive based on the primary election results. And this is primary and caucuses. It was progressive reformers in the early 20th century who wrenched the nominating process from the hands of the party bosses and gave that power to the party membership as a whole. Before that, the party bosses used to determine who the nominees were. But the parties were slow to implement democratic reforms in their nominating processes until the riots at the Democratic National Convention in 1968, when the party could no longer ignore the fact that the delegate selection effectively excluded women, minorities, youth, the poor, and other groups who were not represented in party leadership. So the McGovern-Fraser Commission formed, and they implemented reforms in the Democratic Party's delegate selection process that also encouraged the Republican Party and states to move toward primary elections rather than selecting delegates internally in the party. So they made it a more democratic process. So you can see this is a picture of riots at the 1968 Democratic National Convention that led to the establishment of more open procedures for delegate selection. And these reforms have made recent party conventions much more representative, more minorities, more women, etc. So in terms of competing for delegates, one vestige of party leadership control is the superdelegate. There's one last holdover of this party control, and that is the superdelegate. Superdelegates are people who are awarded automatic slots as delegates to these national party conventions because they are a member of Congress or their party's national committee. And their job is to balance the tendency of the more partisan party electorate and ensure that an electable candidate is given the nomination. Now, the Democratic Party has taken a lot of heat during this most recent election campaign, this 2016 campaign, because the superdelegates were almost all already pledged to Hillary Clinton, and so Bernie Sanders did not have an opportunity. He felt like it was kind of, the system was a little bit rigged against him because the establishment of the superdelegates in the Democratic Party, there are so many superdelegates in the Democratic Party system that whoever has those superdelegates already kind of goes into the primary season with an advantage. So there may be some reform happening in the Democratic Party after what happened with Bernie Sanders. And those emails that were leaked, a lot of them from the Democratic National Committee chairman are talking about those types of things. Now, again, competing for delegates. Long before any primary votes are cast, potential nominees are hard at work wooing support from elected officials, most importantly, governors and other members of Congress. They're also wooing support from top fundraisers and skilled political aides. Since this garnering of key endorsements takes place out of the public eye, it is known as the invisible primary. So this is all the stuff you do behind the scenes trying to win support before you start running publicly. Candidates from the same party try to distinguish themselves from one another by crafting a positive personal image that highlights their qualifications and character, and they seek media attention but try to avoid blunders that will deflate their campaign. Now, the invisible primary includes building a support base even before a candidate formally announces his or her campaign for the presidency. And this is a photo from 2013. And members of this group called I'm Ready for Hillary. This is obviously a group of Hillary Clinton supporters that show their support for Hillary Clinton for president. And this is 3 years before the 2016 campaign. So you can start building support behind the scenes before you even run. Now we have a caucus and a primary system. Most states hold primary elections, but a few hold caucuses, which are meetings where citizens discuss and vote on a nominee. Caucuses are a lot more complicated, they require a lot more effort, so voter participation is lower and reflects more intense feelings because the people that are willing to stand around and participate in a caucus in this long process are people that are really passionate already about politics. Iowa is the first state to hold its caucus, which gives it media attention disproportionate to its size. So Iowa, is not a very large state, but because it's the first caucus, it gets a lot of media attention. New Hampshire is the first state to hold a presidential primary election, which, like the Iowa caucuses, attracts intense media attention. And although the winners in both Iowa and New Hampshire don't always stay the frontrunners, winning these early primaries gives a campaign visibility and momentum, and this attracts donors and supporters. And so candidates who do poorly in early primaries are often forced to drop out of the race due to lack of campaign funding. Some states designate all of their delegates for the winning candidate. Others portion them according to the percentage of the vote. So when you win the primary, you get all the delegates, and others do it proportionally. Okay, if you get all of the delegates, it's a winner-take-all primary. The primary and caucus systems brought welcome democratic reforms to the nominee selection process, but they have developed problems of their own. For starters, the candidates devoted a disproportionate amount of time and attention to the early primary and caucus states, even though the number of delegates at stake is very small. So they spent a lot of time in New Hampshire, they spent a lot of time in Iowa, but the number of delegates they're actually going to receive from those states, if they win those states, are very, very small. And so it's kind of a distorted system in that sense. In 2008, for the first time in many years, the contest for the Democratic nomination turned into a 50-state contest with Obama and Clinton battling in a close race for each delegate. As usual, though, the first caucus in Iowa and the first primary in New Hampshire received far more attention from the candidates than the number of delegates would warrant. Here you can see a map of the 50 states drawn to scale in terms of the number of events the two major Democratic candidates held in them. So if you look at that, look at Iowa. Look how big Iowa is. It's pretty fascinating there. And look how big New Hampshire is, because that's the number of events. They held all these events in those areas because those were early primary and caucus states. And so it just shows disproportionately how much attention these first caucus and primaries get, even though there's not a lot of delegates. Since campaigning is a full-time job, officials running for re-election often neglect their duties. This is a problem. In fact, legislators are often absent for crucial votes in Congress because they're out on the campaign trail. Marco Rubio was heavily criticized for that during the Republican primary race. Most Americans think that money plays too large a role in political campaigns. Voters in primaries and caucuses tend to be unrepresentative of party membership and of the electorate as a whole. Only about 25% of eligible voters cast ballots in primary elections. So think about that, 25%. So if those people are going to go out for primaries, those are people that are already passionate about politics, and they probably don't represent, aren't a good representative sample of the entire United States eligible voting populace. Only about 5% participate in caucuses. So think about that, 5%. So do those people that actually show up, they're such a small number, do they actually represent the will of the people? Finally, the primary system gives tremendous power to the media. They get to be the kingmakers by designating a candidate as the likely winner. Okay, the media can say, oh, Donald Trump is the winner. They can kind of put their spin on it and how they cover the primaries and caucuses. There is no drama in today's party conventions because the winner is known beforehand. As a result, television news coverage has been reduced and ratings have fallen in terms of the convention's coverage. Only 30 million people tuned into Romney's acceptance speech at the 2012 Republican National Convention, while 111 million watched the Giants defeat the Patriots earlier that year. So, conventions don't get a lot of attention and viewership. Today's conventions are carefully scripted infomercials for the party. They're designed to get delegates and viewers energized to help the campaign. The party's platform used to be debated at the convention, but parties are leery of showing any internal dissent. So for that reason, the platform is now agreed behind the scenes and simply unveiled at the convention. And the conventions always end with the nominee announcing his vice president pick, followed by acceptance speeches from both nominees, and the general election campaign is then officially underway when the convention concludes. The word campaign originated as a military term. Generals mounted campaigns, using their limited resources to achieve strategic objectives. Political campaigns are conducted using similar strategies to deploy time, money, and energy in the most effective manner. Campaigns deal almost exclusively in images these days, with the goal of presenting the candidate as a model of desirable leadership qualities, and technology has become crucial to the modern political campaign. Today's campaigns are high-tech, and television is still the main media outlet that connects candidates to voters, but the internet is rapidly catching up, especially with younger voters. The internet has revolutionized campaign fundraising by making it easier to donate and cheaper to solicit funds. Campaigns have long used mailing lists for targeted fundraising, but it's much cheaper to send an email than a letter through the mail. In addition to maintaining websites, candidates must have Twitter feeds and Facebook pages. They have a strong presence on major internet applications, and this is necessary to be competitive in modern political campaigns. Candidates get media attention in two main ways. They do it through advertising and news coverage. The bulk of today's campaign budgets is spent on TV advertising because it reaches the largest audience, and candidates can also control how their image is presented. They do not have as much control of how or even if the news media covers them. Candidates issue press releases and stage events, of course, to attract media coverage, but it's up to the news media to decide which candidates they're going to cover and how to portray them in a positive or negative way. Now, in terms of organizing the campaign, it's a time-consuming process, and it's very expensive. Candidates usually begin by hiring a professional campaign manager. You can actually get a master's degree in campaign management and in campaign fundraising. It's really interesting. This is a whole science to this. So they hire a campaign manager who's responsible for keeping everyone on message and setting the tone for the campaign. Fundraising is essential as money is key to victory. Campaign counsel is also necessary, so a campaign lawyer, to ensure the compliance with the campaign finance laws. Media and campaign consultants are critical to marketing the candidate to the voters, and there will always be a need for volunteers and advance workers to handle the logistics of candidate scheduling and to coordinate events for maximum attendance and media exposure. So if a candidate's going to appear at a school, they need advance people to go set that up. And then although campaigns are mainly about image, candidates must have research and policy staff to brief them on policy-related questions. Their answers will change depending on what the polls say about the voters, so they have to have people that are kind of watching the polls. Candidates must be prepared to change their policy stances the second they don't poll well with potential supporters. They also have a good press secretary, which keeps the candidate in the media spotlight. And finally, the candidate must have a website, and this requires a staff to design it and post information regularly. And most candidates, as I said before, collect donations via their website. So it's an extremely complicated process to run a modern campaign. Many people of moderate means make small donations to political candidates, but the cost of campaigns is so high that wealthy contributors can buy special influence over elected officials to the detriment of the middle class and poorer Americans. There are two basic ways of contributing money to campaigns. Donors can make a direct contribution to the campaign, or they can spend money independently to support a candidate without coordinating this expenditure with the campaign. And we'll kind of look at those. Now, to try to control some of this campaign fundraising, you've had various regulations put into place. And so as corruption and distrust of the government grew in the early 1970s, there was momentum built for campaign finance reform. And in 1974, Congress passed the Federal Election Campaign Act, which required candidates to publicly disclose who contributed to their campaigns and how the money was spent. This law also limited the amount that individuals and interest groups could contribute. Another result of this legislation was the creation of the Federal Election Commission, which serves as the repository of campaign funding information. They have two websites, opensecrets.org and fundraise.org, which allows you to look up campaign finance information, including looking up your friends and neighbors to see how much they've donated. That's kind of interesting. The Federal Election Campaign Act also created a fund for public financing of elections. So when you do your taxes, your federal income taxes, there's a box you can check that'll allow you to donate $3 of your taxes to this fund. It doesn't add $3 to your tax bill, but it just says of the taxes the government collects, $3 can be used towards this fund. And so candidates have to agree to overall spending limits if they accept the money. So that often will limit the amount of money they can raise. So no candidate really accepts federal campaign funds. So it's kind of funny. We have this fund to provide public funding of campaigns, but because you have to agree to limit your spending, in order to accept the money, nobody accepts the money because they can raise more money than they would get from the public funding. So it's kind of a strange thing that's happened. The act originally limited the amount of money that you could spend of your own money on your campaign, but we said before that in the Supreme Court in 1976, in the case of Buckley versus Vallejo, overturned that and said that contributing money to your own campaign cannot be limited because that's an expression of free speech. Ross Perot, for example, spent $60 million of his own money on his 1992 independent bid for president. And there was a time where another great loophole existed in the form of soft money contributions. Soft money was given to parties rather than candidates, so it wasn't subject to these contribution limits. But then the McCain-Feingold Campaign Finance Reform Act of 2002 was passed, and this act banned soft money contributions, although corporations and wealthy donors continue to find new loopholes to gain influence over elected officials. So you said you couldn't give the money directly to the candidate, so you would just give it to the party who would then funnel it to the candidate. Now there are limitations to that also. So this is a good graph that shows when President Obama declined to take federal funding for his campaign. Look at that. Look at the red. The amount of the spending limit if he had accepted the federal funds. First, it was in the nomination process, like in the primaries, and then in the general election. Look how much more money he spent than if he had limited himself to the federal funds. Unbelievable. So unless the spending cap is raised significantly or eliminated, it's unlikely that any future presidential candidates will accept federal funds. So that means public financing of campaigns is probably not going to happen anytime soon. And if you don't have public financing, then you have private financing, and then you have the opportunity for people to have influence and buy political influence. That's the concern. So there are some independent political groups, 527s, things like that. And since wealthy donors are limited in how much they can contribute directly to candidates and soft money contributions have been banned, it was inevitable that a new route for influential spending would be devised. And it's come in the form of what they call 527 groups, named after a section of the federal tax code that covers them. These groups can spend unlimited amounts provided that they spend the money independently with no coordination with the campaign and that they don't endorse a candidate explicitly. So they may talk about the national debt, or they may be pro-life. They'll talk about something where they don't endorse the candidate explicitly, but if you are swayed to their side, there's only one candidate you're really going to vote for. So until 2010, corporations and unions could not electioneer, could not campaign for, participate in the electoral process, but with one of these groups in the final 60 days before the election. But the court ruled 5-4 in Citizens United versus FEC that money equals speech and corporations are people. So restrictions on electioneering were a violation of speech rights. And this was one of the court's more controversial decisions. And you'll hear Citizens United, they talked about it at the Democratic Convention, they've talked about it in the debates. So in other words, they used to have a limit that up to 60 days before an election, the last 60 days before an election, these groups corporations couldn't really spend money. Like the clean energy group couldn't spend money, or the coal industry couldn't spend money to try to sway people to a political candidate. But then that was overturned in the Citizens United that said that in fact, corporations are like people and they have the right to free speech. So it was really controversial, but it is what it is. So here's an example. The reason behind the Citizens United lawsuit, David Bossie, shown here, is the president of Citizens United, which was a conservative nonprofit organization that in 2008 produced Hillary the movie. And it was a very condemning movie about Hillary Clinton. And when the Federal Election Commission ruled that this movie was unlawful electioneering, Citizens United successfully sued, establishing the right of any group to engage in independent political expenditures. So it's kind of interesting. All right, so from the donor's perspective, there remained one problem with the unlimited spending they could do with 527 groups. It still had to be reported. So they created another loophole. If they set up what was called a 501c group instead of a 527 group, they didn't have to publicly disclose the names of donors or the amounts of donations. And so the Citizens United ruling led to the creation of new interest groups dubbed super PACs because of the immense amounts of money that can be provided that's in the form of independent expenditures. So again, it's interesting. These 501c groups don't have to report the names of their donors or the amounts of the donations. And that Catholic Votes group that a lot of parishes have been referring Catholic voters to in Charlotte, that is a 501c. So if you look on their website, you do not see a list of their donors or how much is donated. So you don't really know who's involved behind that group. Now, there's a lot of concern that campaigns in the U.S. in particular are very expensive. And for example, the Center for Responsive Politics totaled the cost of the 2012 campaigns for presidency and Congress, and they said it was about $6.3 billion was spent. That's just insane. That's a lot of money. And incumbents, meaning people that have already been in power, must spend so much of their time fundraising that they're distracted from doing their jobs. But a minority of Americans point out the cost of elections is actually quite small when you look at it as a portion of the GDP or the average output per person. Now, many want to know, is there a link between money and victory? Is there a direct link between the amount a candidate spends and the number of votes he receives. And some political scientists would say no. They note that an incumbent has to spend a lot of money only if he has a strong challenger. So less spending can mean a more secure seat, that is, more votes. But in fact, some argue that there's a point of diminishing returns. So the doctrine of sufficiency states that you need to spend enough to get your message across, but spending more than your opponent isn't always necessary. There are notable examples of candidates who outspent their opponents 5-1 and yet still lost. How important are campaigns in determining electoral outcomes? Not as important as you'd think, given the amount of time, energy, and money devoted to campaigns. Campaigns serve three main purposes. They reinforce voters' preferences for candidates. They get them to contribute time or money rather than merely voting. They convert voters or they can change minds. Research over the past half century has shown that campaigns mainly reinforce and activate. Only rarely do they actually convert people to changing their minds. Okay, so mainly they reinforce. If you're a Donald Trump supporter, they reinforce your beliefs on why he's the right candidate, and they activate you to go out and give him money or to campaign for him. But they don't actually tend to change people's minds who haven't decided to vote for him. So people have a remarkable capacity for selective perception. That is, they pay the most attention to things they already agree with and interpret events according to their own predispositions. People also tend to vote according to their party identification, which can change but rarely does. The advantage of incumbents in terms of name recognition and record also tends to outweigh the influence of political campaigns. And in order to try to convert voters, candidates need to focus on a wedge issue, something that splits members of the other party, and then try to lure those voters who feel strongly about that one issue. Democrats, for example, will try to appeal to pro-choice Republicans, and Republicans will attempt to win over anti-abortion Democrats. Also, think about this. Hillary Clinton's campaign is trying to win over people that are upset with Trump's with the things he said about women. They're trying to pull them. That's a wedge issue, right? How he treats women. And so that campaign is working on converting voters. American electoral history is defined by the continual expansions of suffrage, or the right to vote. Today, most citizens over the age of 18 can vote. Convicted felons are prohibited from voting in some states for a period of time, and in 10 states they are prohibited for voting for life. And as the franchise has expanded, a smaller percentage of the electorate has bothered to vote. So that's kind of interesting. Even smaller percentages vote in midterm congressional elections than in presidential elections. And for example, only 40% of eligible voters cast their ballots in congressional midterm elections in 2010. Which is kind of sad. So occasionally election outcomes are so close that all the individual ballots have to be carefully recounted. Here's a picture of an election official examining a ballot in the 2008 Minnesota Senate race, with the representatives from the opposing candidates observing on either side. Okay, so you've got a Representative Al Franken observing, and then you've got someone for Norm Coleman, who is the opponent. You've got someone from each of their campaigns observing the election official doing the recount. In the original count, Norm Coleman finished 215 votes ahead, but after the recount, Al Franken won the election by 225 votes. So sometimes this can get a little dicey. Now, deciding whether to vote. It's rare for one vote to determine an election, so voters might decide that their vote doesn't matter and not bother to get to the polls on election day. Tuesday is also a work day for most people, and so it can be difficult to take time to get to the polls, and it's time-consuming to learn about the candidates and to make up your mind. So we saw those other candidates on the ballot that I didn't know anything about, some of these judges and things like that. So is it rational to vote? And that really depends on your perspective. If you see genuine policy differences between the candidates and believe that one or the other would be a better fit for the country, then yes, it's rational to vote. People who vote tend to have a sense of what we call political efficacy. That is, they believe that ordinary people can influence the government. So if you lack that belief, then you are unlikely to bother to vote unless you have a strong sense of civic duty. And note that most other democratic countries make election day a holiday or hold elections on the weekends. And so it's kind of strange that we hold elections on a weekday. Another reason that turnout is lower in the US than other democratic countries is the burden of voter registration. So registration laws differ by state, and some states allow registration on election day, and others require that you register really far in advance. States with less burdensome registration requirements tend to have a higher turnout, which makes sense. In 1993, Congress tried to simplify the registration process with the passage of the Motor Voter Act, which allowed voters to register by ticking a box on their driver's license application or driver's license renewal forms. And this law didn't lead to the expected increase in voter turnout. Yeah, it registered more voters because when you renewed your driver's license or got your driver's license, you could register to vote at the same time. But people didn't actually then exercise that vote. In most other democratic countries, the burden falls on the government to make sure that all eligible citizens are registered. The process is automatic, and the citizen doesn't have to do anything besides show up to vote. The U.S. also holds elections more often than most other democratic countries, and it offers voters fewer meaningful choices among candidates. Recently, states have begun to pass laws that require voters to show a government-issued photo ID, such as a driver's license or a passport to prove they are who they say they are. However, some groups are less likely to have photo IDs. The poor, I mean, if you don't have a car, then you're not going to have a driver's license, so you won't have a photo ID. And so many feel that laws may discriminate against these people. And so that's a big concern here in North Carolina. We passed a law saying that you needed photo ID in order to vote, but that has been really hung up on the courts, and that has not been the case going forward because of that. Like, there's actually been a judge has stayed that. So it's a controversial issue. So I said here, this is a picture. In recent years, a number of states have adopted laws requiring voters to show a photo ID at the polls, and you can see an election judge in Missouri here using a new voter registration computer system to scan a voter's driver's license. And that's really what they want to try to do in North Carolina. Now, who votes? Who votes and who doesn't is not random. There are certain demographic features that are closely related to voter turnout, and most important is education. The more educated someone is, the more likely the person is to vote. And this is due in part to an increased sense of political efficacy and an ability to clear the bureaucratic hurdles that are often in place when it comes to voting. Age is the second greatest predictor of voting. Older citizens are much more likely to vote, with those over 65 the most likely to vote, and those under 25 the least likely to vote. Turnout among younger voters is lower in part because they're less settled, which makes it more of a burden to register to vote. Once you buy a house, have a family, join a profession, you begin to develop a stronger sense of how political decisions affect your life, too. The turnout of minority voters has historically been lower than their percentage in the population, although that changed in the 2008 presidential election. Women are slightly more likely to vote than men, and married people tend to vote. Married people who tend to be more tied into their communities are more likely to vote than single people. Government employees have more at stake in elections and a greater sense of how the government works, so they're more likely to vote than other citizens. And what are the policy consequences of this voter participation? If women are more likely to vote than men, then are we going to see more things benefiting women in politics? It's kind of interesting. This is a table with turnout rates for groups of citizens in 2012 and 2010. And you can see who is more likely to vote and who is least likely to vote. There's been a lot of movements to try to get out the vote, get people to go out and vote. This is the Rock the Vote movement here, and this has been around since the early 1990s, and it sought to engage and build political power for young people in the United States. They often use pop music stars to urge young people to vote. Some other things that explain voters' decision-making process. Do voters select candidates whose policy views they prefer? That would make sense. If it were the case, the winner could assume that he had a mandate from the people to implement his policies. But there's ample evidence that policy views play only a small role in voter selection. Instead, voters base their decisions on their party identification and their personal view of the candidates a lot of times. So people voting for Hillary Clinton may not agree with her policies. It may just be because they personally have a problem with Donald Trump, or vice versa. They might vote for Trump because they feel that Hillary is untrustworthy. So that doesn't mean that then that candidate that wins has a mandate, meaning the people said, yes, I agree with your policy positions, and yes, I want you to go to Washington and implement them. They could be voting for them for entirely different reasons, which makes it even more complicated. Party identification is crucial for many voters because it provides a stable perspective from which voters can view the political world. So, like sports team loyalty and religious affiliation, voters rarely change their party identification. It gives them a cue as to who is on their side. A voter doesn't need to know where every candidate stands in different issues for state and local office. If he usually votes for one party, he can simply choose the candidate for each office from that party. Party identification used to be the single strongest predictor of voting behavior, but party loyalty has really gone down since the 1960s. Modern technology makes it easier to obtain information about candidates, and campaigns are about individuals more than they are about parties today. Some voters float between the parties depending upon their view of the candidates that election, and floating voters are more likely to be young with less established party preferences. To win an election, a candidate must craft a personal image that appeals to voters, and researchers have found that candidates do best when they project an image of integrity, reliability, and competence. And so, is it superficial and irrational for voters to pick candidates based on perceived personal qualities rather than policy positions? Some say yes, some say no. It's irrational to the extent that most images are crafted by consultants and rather than being reflective of the candidate's true qualities. But on the other hand, it isn't superficial because you can't know or agree with the candidate on every policy issue, but you want someone competent and reliable to be commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and you want someone with integrity to be making policy decisions. And I think you see all of these things being taken into consideration with the 2016 campaign. It isn't easy for citizens to vote based on policy issues. They have to have a clear sense of their own issue preferences and know where the candidates stand in relation to those preferences. So the candidates also need to differentiate themselves on policy issues so that citizens can vote for the candidate whose policy preferences are closest to their own. Candidates are often deliberately ambiguous about their policy views. They don't give any specifics, and a voter may agree with one candidate on some issues and another candidate on different issues. It's challenging for voters to become informed of where candidates stand, but it's a bit easier today now that we have primary elections instead of party bosses selecting the nominee. Candidates must take some policy stances in the primary in order to distinguish themselves from other potential nominees from within their own party. A more stable truism of American elections is that voters reward the party in power in good economic times and punish it in bad. So the state of the economy leading up to the presidential election presented a real challenge for Barack Obama. In 2007, Obama narrowly edged out Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination by emphasizing change over experience, which is the same thing that Trump's trying to do in 2016. McCain's supposed independent streak had been a handicap for him in appealing to his party's conservative base. However, 2008 was a year when many Republicans wanted change, and he clinched the primaries with relative ease. He also picked the first female Republican nominee for vice president. However, doubts about her competence later plagued the campaign. In the 2008 general election, Obama benefited from the same problem that dragged him down in 2012, the economy. It was easier for a young Democratic candidate to promise change than for an experienced Republican to distance himself from President Bush and unpopular congressional Republicans. So in 2012, however, it was likewise easy for Romney to make the claim that he could fix the economy because he was not the one in power. There's a picture from Obama when he won his re-election campaign in 2012. This map shows the number of votes each state had in the Electoral College in 2012 and which states were carried by each party. So obviously red are Republicans, blue are Democrats. And then the next slide shows exit poll results that show the breakdown of the demographics for those who voted for Barack Obama. So you can see the demographics there, that females voted more than males for Obama, young people voted more than old people, African American voted overwhelmingly for Barack Obama. You can just see all of the different demographics there. Look at that. That's in the 2012 election, 50% of Catholics voted for Obama. Okay, so really interesting there. The last thing about elections that's really controversial is the Electoral College. The winner of the presidential election is chosen by the Electoral College, not the voters. The Electoral College is unique to the United States, and it's no longer a popular institution. Most people want it abolished because of its undemocratic nature and the effect it has on the presidential campaign. The founders created the Electoral College precisely because they didn't want the president selected democratically by the masses. They believed that only elites were qualified to make that choice on behalf of everyone. The number of electors in each state is equal to the number of senators and representatives in that state. So in 48 states, the candidate who wins the most votes, no matter by how thin a margin, gets all of that state's electoral votes. It's a winner-take-all system. Only Maine and Nebraska divide their electoral votes proportionally based on, what proportion of the votes that candidate wins. It's possible for a candidate to receive enough electoral votes to win the election without winning a majority of the popular vote, as happened in the presidential election of 2000, when George W. Bush won the Electoral College, but Al Gore won the popular vote. Elections are key to a peaceful transition of power because leaders can be replaced without being overthrown. They socialize and institutionalize political activity. They channel participation through the electoral process rather than riots and revolutions. And because election by the people gives leaders legitimacy, it is often thought the only thing better than democracy is more democracy. But is that true? Can our system be more democratic? Something to think about. Because nominees are chosen by voters and not party elites, party outsiders have a greater opportunity to be selected as a candidate than in many other democracies. But the downside to all this democracy is that elected officials in the U.S. are required to wage a permanent campaign. Americans are often overwhelmed by the constant campaigning and tend to tune out. Good candidates are discouraged from running for office by the demands of campaigning and the constant worrisome burden of fundraising. The final chapter of any presidential campaign is the swearing in of the winner at noon on the following January 20th. Here, Barack Obama takes the oath in 2009. Legislative campaigns, it's complicated. People want to know, do electoral results affect public policy to any significant degree? And juries really haven't decided. Elections are important, but it really depends on the policy differences between the candidates and whether or not, if there's a big enough difference, whether or not it affects the outcome. Legislative campaigns are conducted locally in states and districts, and to appeal to local voters, candidates promise new government programs, subsidies, and tax breaks. And these are tailored to local interests. And these promises add up and explain why legislators find it much easier to expand the scope of government than to limit government. Elections tend to reinforce the idea that the government is the servant to the voters, not its master, and must be responsive to the needs of the voters. So expanding the state's power is sometimes seen as an increasing its capacity to serve citizens. So democracy increases the desire of the citizen to benefit from the state and reduces his wish to be protected from it. So it's really a complicated system, but it's a system we have. And that concludes Chapter 9.